Jelly Roll has filed for divorce from his wife, Bunnie Xo, after nearly 10 years of marriage. Reports are that the decision was mutual. It's a private family matter.
Some love stories get treated like proof that love can survive absolutely anything. Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo were that story for millions of people. A struggling musician sleeping in a van and a woman who had already lived 100 lifetimes found each other in Las Vegas, fell in love against every possible odd, and somehow turned that unlikely beginning into one of the most talked about marriages in modern country music. They survived infidelity. They survived addiction. They survived the kind of fame that swallows most relationships whole. So when the words divorce and Jelly Roll started appearing in the same headline in the summer of 2026, it did not just surprise people. It broke something in the story a lot of fans thought they understood completely. This is the story of what actually happened, told through what has been confirmed, what has only been rumored, and the quiet moments in between that. Looking back, we're trying to tell us something long before either of them said a word. On May 18, 2026, Jelly Roll, whose real name is Jason Bradley DeFord, filed for divorce from his wife of nearly a decade, Bunnie Xo, whose real name is Elisa DeFord. The filing was made in Williamson County, Tennessee, and it listed the reason as irreconcilable differences, the same three words courts have used for generations to describe two people who simply cannot find their way back to each other anymore. The news did not become public right away. It sat quietly in a courthouse file for almost a month before TMZ broke the story in mid-June, and within hours it was everywhere. Two people who had built an entire public identity around loving each other loudly and unapologetically were, according to the paperwork, already legally done. What made the timing especially hard for fans to process was what had happened only a few months earlier. At the Grammy Awards in February 2026, Jelly Roll and Bunnie were photographed together, looking every bit the devoted couple the world had come to expect, affectionate on the red carpet and inside the venue, with Jelly Roll publicly thanking her from the stage after winning Best Contemporary Country Album. It was the kind of moment that gets replayed in highlight reels for years. Nobody watching that night could have guessed that within roughly 3 months, one of them would be sitting across from a divorce attorney instead of a wedding planner. Bunnie had also just released a memoir that February, called Stripped Down, Unfiltered and Unapologetic, and in interviews promoting the book, she sounded like a woman who felt she had finally reached solid ground. She talked about the two of them being in an exciting new chapter, about goals they had once only dreamed about finally becoming real, about a 5-year plan they had first whispered to each other on the very night they got together. She sounded certain. She sounded like someone building toward a future, not someone quietly preparing to walk away from one. And that future, as far as anyone outside their closest circle knew, included a baby. For years, the couple had spoken with real vulnerability about wanting a child of their own together and about how difficult that journey had been for Bunnie's body. As recently as February 2026, they had chosen a surrogate and were hoping to welcome twins. 3 months later, they were headed for divorce instead. That is not a slow fade. That is a story that changed direction almost overnight, and it is exactly why so many people refused to believe the initial reports when they first saw them. Once the movers arrived at the couple's shared Tennessee home, though, disbelief stopped being an option. Photographs of moving trucks outside the property confirmed that whatever was happening was not a rumor and was not slowing down. Here's the part of the story that matters most, and the part that a lot of headlines have quietly skipped over. Jelly Roll has not stood in front of a microphone and delivered some dramatic, tell-all explanation for why his marriage ended. There has been no tearful sit-down interview where he lays out a single clear reason. Both he and Bunnie describe the split, through people close to them, as a mutual decision and a private family matter, which is a phrase that tells you almost nothing except that they intend to keep it that way. So if there was ever going to be an admission, it was never going to arrive as a headline-ready confession. It was always going to come out sideways, through the things he and Bunnie have said in the months and years leading up to this moment, through the small contradictions between what they showed the world and what was apparently happening underneath it. And when you go back and actually listen to what Bunnie herself has said, in her memoir and in the interviews around it, you start to hear the outline of an answer neither of them ever announced directly. Long before the divorce filing, Bunnie had already been remarkably candid about the fact that this was never a conventional marriage, and that its survival never depended on it becoming one. She has explained plainly that a former sex worker and a former hustler-turned-musician were not going to fall in love the same way two people who grew up behind white picket fences might, and that their relationship operated by rules that looked nothing like the traditional version of marriage most people picture. She has said outright that coming into this relationship, neither of them was a traditional bride and groom, and that expecting their bond to behave like a textbook marriage was never realistic in the first place. That is not nothing. That is, in its own way, the closest thing to an explanation either of them has given us. Not a scandal, not a single villain, a structure that worked brilliantly for years and then, under the accumulated weight of fame, distance, and everything they had already survived together, stopped holding the way it once did. To understand how something this unlikely could unravel, you have to go back to how unlikely it was in the first place. Jelly Roll and Bunnie met in Las Vegas in 2015. At the time, he was nobody in the eyes of the wider music industry, playing small shows for whatever crowd showed up and living out of a van while he tried to make something out of nothing. She was working as a high-end escort and was actually in the room that night with someone else entirely. On paper, there was no version of the future where these two people ended up married. He has joked openly since then that she was not his type, that he was not hers, that by every conventional measure they made no sense together at all. But something happened anyway. A friendship formed first, quiet and unglamorous, built on him texting her for advice about raising his daughter and her actually showing up for those conversations. By 2016, that friendship had turned into something neither of them could keep pretending was just friendship. At a concert that August, he asked her, without any of the polish of a planned proposal, whether she would marry him that night in Las Vegas. She said yes immediately, and they were married at a small chapel days later, two people with almost nothing in their bank accounts betting everything they had on each other instead. Only days before that wedding, Jelly Roll had welcomed a son with a previous partner, adding yet another layer of complication to an already chaotic beginning. Bunnie did not step back from any of it. She stepped into a role as stepmother to his children, helped fight for custody at a time when their biological mother was struggling with addiction, and got sober herself in the process, all while helping build a life for a man who, at that point, had very little to offer beyond his ambition. Whatever else happened later in their story, that early sacrifice was real, and it is part of why so many fans felt so invested in seeing this marriage succeed. This was not the first time people assumed Jelly Roll and Bunnie's marriage was finished. In 2018, only 2 years into their relationship, Bunnie discovered he had been unfaithful to her. It was not a single lapse he immediately confessed to. By her own later account, it was something that unfolded over an extended period, and finding out about it devastated her in a way she has described candidly in the years since. She has said that when she learned the truth, she was hurt in a way she never expected from him specifically, that she had believed he was different, and that in that moment her heart broke completely. Rather than turning that pain outward first, she has said her instinct was to ask herself why she kept ending up with men who hurt her that way, a question that speaks to just how much self-examination she brought into rebuilding what came next. Jelly Roll, for his part, has talked about that period with unusual honesty for a man in his position. He has called it one of the worst chapters of his adult life, has admitted to the affair without excuses, and has talked about being surrounded at the time by people who were themselves cheating, using drugs, and generally modeling exactly the kind of behavior he ended up mirroring. He did not dress it up. He owned it. What followed was years of quiet, unglamorous rebuilding, the kind that never makes it into a highlight reel because it mostly looks like two people slowly learning to trust each other again in private. Bunnie has said it took years before she genuinely believed he loved her again, years before she stopped feeling disposable, a word she has used more than once to describe how that betrayal made her feel long after the initial wound had technically healed. That they came back from it at all is part of what made their story so compelling to outsiders. It is also, in hindsight, a reminder that even a relationship strong enough to survive a devastating betrayal is not automatically immune to everything else life throws at it later. If the affair was the first real test of their marriage, fame turned out to be a much slower, quieter one. In the years that followed their reconciliation, Both of them became enormously successful in their own right, and not in a way that folded neatly into a shared life. Bunnie built her own independent career from the ground up, growing a podcast into a genuine media presence with millions of monthly downloads and a loyal audience who followed her for her own voice, not her husband's. She was no longer someone waiting at home for a musician to make it big. She had her own platform, her own income, and her own identity that did not depend on being anyone's wife. At the same time, Jelly Roll's career exploded in a way almost nobody could have predicted for a man who was still playing to small crowds only a few years earlier. He went from tiny bar shows to arenas, from being unknown outside a niche audience to becoming one of the most recognized names in country music, complete with award show wins and a redemption narrative that resonated with an enormous audience across the country. Both of those stories are genuinely impressive on their own, but two people who once shared the cramped space of a single van were now living lives so large and so independently structured that the natural, everyday closeness that had once held their relationship together had to be actively maintained rather than simply assumed. He was constantly on the road. She was constantly building something of her own. That is not automatically a recipe for divorce, but it is exactly the kind of quiet distance that, left unaddressed for long enough, can slowly turn from something manageable into something neither person quite notices growing until it is already very wide. It would be easy to look at the divorce and assume it followed some hidden scandal, some single dramatic betrayal nobody has uncovered yet. But everything Bunnie has said publicly, both in her memoir and in the interviews that followed it, points towards something quieter and more structural than that. She has been consistent for years in describing their relationship as intentionally unconventional, built on an understanding that a marriage between a former sex worker and a former street hustler was never going to look like a textbook version of commitment, and that trying to force it into that shape would have been its own kind of failure. That framing matters enormously when you look at how the divorce has actually been handled. Both sides have insisted publicly that no one cheated this time, that the split was amicable, and their settlement reportedly includes a clause preventing either of them from speaking badly about the other. According to court documents obtained by entertainment outlets, the two are dividing significant shared assets, including an aircraft, vehicles, and multiple properties, along with their individual intellectual property, and Jelly Roll agreed to a one-time lump sum payment to Bunnie, rather than any ongoing alimony. There's no messy public court battle here. There is no war being waged across social media. Whatever ended this marriage, both people involved have gone out of their way to end it with the same private, controlled dignity that defined how they handled their reconciliation years earlier. In the absence of a direct explanation from either Jelly Roll or Bunnie, entertainment media has not stayed quiet. One widely circulated claim, attributed to celebrity gossip columnist Rob Shooter, suggested the split was not driven by cheating or scandal at all, but by tension over Bunnie potentially returning to the adult entertainment industry, an industry she had walked away from years earlier after marrying Jelly Roll. According to that reporting, discussions about her career direction became increasingly difficult as his own fame grew, and the two of them eventually recognized they wanted genuinely different futures. It is worth being honest about what this is and is not. It is a claim from a gossip source, not a confirmed statement from either Jelly Roll or Bunnie themselves. Neither of them has publicly validated it as the reason for the divorce. It fits, in a general sense, with the story Bunnie has told for years about their marriage never operating under conventional rules, and about her own identity always mattering as much to her as her role as a wife. But fitting a narrative and being confirmed as fact are two very different things, and anyone telling this story honestly has to hold that distinction carefully rather than presenting speculation as if it were an admission. What can be said with more confidence is this: despite the divorce, both sides have indicated they still intend to move forward with having a child together through their surrogate, and they plan to co-parent, which suggests that whatever pulled them apart as a couple did not destroy the underlying respect and shared commitment they still have toward the family they were building. Insiders describing the situation have said there is clearly still love between them, and that even as an unconventional marriage, it served exactly the purpose it was meant to for as long as it lasted. Looking back now, there were small moments in the weeks before the divorce became public that, at the time, read as nothing more than ordinary life, but in hindsight carry a different weight entirely. Jelly Roll continued performing and touring right through this period, throwing himself back into work the way he always has during difficult stretches of his life. Bunnie, for her part, has never been someone who processes pain by disappearing quietly. She has continued showing up publicly, reclaiming her own sense of self, and reminding her audience, in the same direct voice that built her career, that she has never been a woman defined entirely by any relationship, including this one. That instinct, to keep moving rather than to collapse in public, has been consistent in both of them for years. Through the affair, through their years of rebuilding, and now through the end of their marriage itself. It is part of why, even now, so many fans hold onto the hope that this ending might not be as final or as bitter as divorces often become, especially given that they are still raising children together and still planning to welcome another child through their surrogate despite no longer being a couple. So where does that leave the fairy tale so many people believed in for nearly a decade? Somewhere more complicated and more human than a simple villain and victim story ever could have been. Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo built a relationship out of two lives that were never supposed to intersect, survived a betrayal that would have ended most marriages permanently, and then built two enormous, separate careers on top of an already unconventional foundation. Along the way, they were remarkably honest, at least in general terms, about the fact that their marriage never followed traditional rules, and that its survival always depended on both of them continuing to choose that unusual shape together, again and again, for as long as it worked for both of them. At some point, according to everything that has actually been confirmed rather than rumored, it stopped working the way it once did, and instead of turning that into a public spectacle, they chose to end it quietly, on terms they largely controlled, while still committing to raising their family together going forward. Whether the specific breaking point was the pressure of fame, the pull of two increasingly separate identities, a genuine disagreement about the future Bunnie wanted for herself, or simply the slow accumulation of everything they had already survived together finally catching up with them, remains something only the two of them fully know. What is clear is that neither of them has offered the world a tidy, dramatic confession, and maybe that restraint is itself the most honest thing either of them could give the people who followed their story for so long. Not every ending needs a villain. Sometimes two people who fought harder than almost anyone to stay together simply reach a point where staying together is no longer the thing that serves either of them, and they have enough respect left for what they built to let each other go quietly instead of tearing it apart in public. What do you think actually pulled these two apart after everything they had already survived together? Let us know in the comments.